Welcome to this edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. And joining me, as usual, is my sidekick, Don Cooney. Don is a professor over in the School of Social Work at WMU and also serves as a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. And we're very, very excited to welcome Felix Brooks, who's going to join us as a regular member of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. You recognize Felix if you've been watching the show. He's been on as a guest several times, but we finally roped him into coming on and being a regular commentator, or viewmeister,
That's right,
as we used to call ourselves. So Felix is currently the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College, formerly worked for a few years out at the Kalamazoo County Juvenile Court as a probation officer. So Felix, welcome.
Thank
Glad
you.
to have you on board and
Glad to
be
be
part
here.
of the team here. So.
Welcome. They put him on the contract, same salary?
He gets the
Okay.
same salary as you do, John.
Man.
Yeah.
we can
And I
afford
doubled
it.
your salary last year.
Oh, man.
Well, we thought this is our first program for 2015, and we thought, as we've done in previous years, that perhaps a look back at what happened in the previous year, 2014, would be good, and then sort of looking ahead to what some of the things that might be going on in the coming year, 2015. And I think with regard to some of the topics, we'll be doing both at the same time, looking back and then moving on to, okay, what's going to happen with this issue coming up. So let's get started, and I think the first topic that we can talk about perhaps is the midterm elections of 2014. And we know a couple of things about that election. It resulted in Republican control of the Congress because the Republicans captured the Senate. They already held the House, and they actually increased their numbers in the House of Representatives, but they also now control the Senate. And so President Obama, in the final 2 years of his second term, will be facing a Congress that's under complete Republican control. The other thing about that election that struck me was how expensive it was. Almost $4 billion were spent on the midterm elections. A lot of it, of course, was dark money, as they say, money that came in from various interest groups that in many cases you could not even trace back to who the donors were. But large corporations and conservative think tanks played a tremendous role in funneling dark money to many Republican candidates. And the final thing that struck me about this election was the fact that there was very low turnout, which is not surprising for a midterm election.
Right.
But this time it seemed particularly low, and that low turnout, it seems to me, had a very decisive factor in allowing some Republican candidates to capture Senate seats or maintain House seats. So how about you guys? What's your take on the elections, and what do you see happening as a result of the elections for the coming year? Felix?
Well, I think you can look at it in several ways. One, it sort of frees up the president because he no longer has a majority in one of the houses. So the Republicans, if they really want to get things accomplished, they're going to have to work with him. You know, they talked about, him poisoning the well with some of the things he did on immigration, but the bottom line is there's 2 years to 2016. And they're staking their strategy for having a Republican president on what happens in the next 2 years. So they're going to have to make some decisions, too, about whether or not they're going to send some legislation that they know the president's going to sign that they can actually take credit for.
Right.
So strategy is going to be particularly important here.
Yeah. And along those lines, just a couple things that really strike me. This really looked like the warm-up for the 2016 election, because everybody immediately is looking at how's this going to affect us in 2016. So what I see happening now is a lot of the rhetoric about all the anti-Obama thing, anti-immigration thing, the anti-climate change, the anti-Obamacare thing. Now they're starting to step back a little bit, some of the Republicans, and saying, I'm really going to look bad. I'm really going to alienate the Hispanic community further if I do what we talked about doing with immigration. So they're holding back on that, and that's interesting to me.
Yeah, because so much of midterm elections is structural.
Right.
I mean, we know low turnout has to do with a lot of times groups, minority groups or whatever, don't turn out big for midterm elections, but they do turn out for presidential elections. And I think a lot of what Don's saying is going to come into effect in 2016. You're going to have a different demographic in terms of turnout in 2016. That's not necessarily going to play to the Republicans as an advantage, and they know that now. So they're going to have to moderate themselves.
Yeah. But that low turnout thing, I saw some statistics from the Pew Research establishment, and they showed, and we know this intuitively, but to me, the figures were stark. The higher your income, the more likely you were to vote. But with the lowest level, the bottom 20%, it's less and less voting. And I think there's two things here. Here, we got this film, Selma, out, talking about how hard people fought for the Voting Rights Act. Now we know that the Voting Rights Act has been limited. It's been weakened because of some of the decisions last year by the courts. And it's more difficult for people of color in the South to vote. And the second thing is, I think that a lot of people at the bottom of the economic ladder have lost confidence in government. Feel that they don't
agree.
Well, it doesn't make any difference. Why should I get involved in this? It's all about money anyhow. It's all about these people. They got control. That's got to turn around by 2016 if we're going to have any chance of making major changes in this country.
Yeah, I think that 2016 is already underway. I mean, we already have people declaring their candidacies and maneuvering to get in. Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. And is she going to be contested at all by any other Democrats? And I mean, we're still 2 years away, and already it's underway. But I think you're right that what's going to happen in the current session of Congress, that election looms large out there, and it's going to have an impact on the kind of things that can go on. President Obama has the veto power, and in most cases, the Republicans are not going to have enough votes to override his vetoes.
No.
So if the Republicans want to play hardball and send all this ridiculous legislation down the pike, it'll just get vetoed. And I think for the most part, if the Republicans adopt that strategy, most of the stuff that they're going to be sending is going to be very unpopular with the majority of Americans. So if they do that, they're going to poison the well, as you said, for 2016. So they're going to have to maybe think about long and hard about how they're going to react.
As you said, Felix, President Obama is acting like a different guy. I mean, he's taking bold steps that we were hoping he would take 6 years ago, but now he's feeling like a free man. I want to do this stuff, and I'm going to put these things out here, like free community college education, like paid health, paid holidays, paid days off if you're sick, and taking stronger stances on the climate change and things like that. I mean, those are real positive things, and I don't think he's felt free to do that in the past.
I don't think he has. So, I mean, even his announcement on immigration, that was the first sign right there. That, you know what?
Right.
I'm liberated here.
Yeah.
I'm going to put this out there, because what do I actually have to lose here?
And the more he advances progressive proposals and has them turned down by the Republican Congress, the stronger I think that makes the Democratic contender's position in 2016.
And strangely, well, not strangely enough, but his approval ratings have actually gone up since that time. I think by almost 10 points.
Wow.
Since shortly before the midterms.
Well, you and I, Don, both have talked about this before, that we think it's always been a mistake for the Democratic Party to try to, hew to the center right, as opposed to moving more toward a progressive agenda.
Right.
If you look at where the voters are in this country, they're mostly in agreement with the progressive issues and the progressive agenda, but the Democratic Party, ever since the Clinton days, has decided that they have to take a center-right position in order to win elections. And that might have been true at some point, but I think now it hinders and hurts the Democratic Party if they continue to take that particular track. So.
Yeah, because all the polls show that if you ask people if they think everybody should have health care, they overwhelming for that. If you talk about
minimum
wage, right, and people that are doing their best but can't support themselves, should we help those people? Yeah, all those different things. But the Democrats have run away from that, and they've run in a different direction, and it was a mistake. It certainly was a mistake.
I mean, they didn't run on any of the good things that were going on in the economy prior to the elections that we just had, which struck me as odd. They didn't want the president to come to any of the states, fearing that it would be a disaster, but it ended up being that way anyway.
So, right.
They would have been better off rolling the dice.
Absolutely.
Speaking of mistakes and disasters, though, I do think the president is headed in the direction of making a huge mistake. and that is with the new trade agreement that's
Yeah.
being negotiated.
I agree.
Mostly negotiated in secret. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's like many of the other trade issues in the past, like NAFTA and others. NAFTA was one of the crowning achievements of the Bill Clinton era, and
Yeah.
it was a disastrous trade bill. It's led to greater trade imbalances, more unemployment, more lost jobs for Americans, greater economic inequality, weakened environmental and labor standards.
Wage stagnation.
Wage
Yes.
stagnation. I mean, it's
Wage
just been a
stagnation.
total disaster. The Center for Public Integrity and Public Interest group just came out with some new studies of previous trade policies documenting what a disastrous record they have. And yet here we are again now with the president asking the Congress to give him fast-tracked authority,
Right.
which basically means Congress gives up their ability to even take a look at this and debate what's in it, and the president has all the authority to just go ahead and approve it on his own, which I think is a disaster in and of itself. The executive branch should not have that much power. Congress ought to
Right.
step up and take their responsibility.
Yes.
But at the same time, it also allows this to be done in greater secrecy and to move it along before people get a chance to really take a look at it. And of course, the large corporations and the Wall Street banks, they've been in on this from the very beginning.
Right.
They're at the table helping to shape this trade bill. And yet the ordinary citizens and labor unions and other organizations are kept in the dark about what's really in there. But if it fits in with any of the other trade agreements, it'll be a disaster for most of the American people. But it'd be obviously a boon to the corporations and the Wall Street banks.
Absolutely.
And to our Asian trading partners who stand to gain greatly from this agreement. So,
especially in the economy now, which is recovered. We've had 57 months of straight of job growth, but it's still fragile,
It's fragile.
and especially in the middle.
Right, because what's not going up are wages.
Yep.
Wages are not going up. People aren't making living wages. They're not getting enough to have a decent life.
Yep.
And this is just going to weaken it more. And I really am opposed to not having a national debate about this. If you put it on fast track and it's just out of the mainstream and we don't even talk about this, people aren't aware of what these things do. So that's really a mistake to try to push for that fast track. I don't know why President Obama's doing that.
and these trade agreements are a disaster for the environment.
Yes.
And they're really a disaster for attempting to do anything about climate change. And here's why. So a long time ago when I was starting to do some research on these trade agreements, I came to the realization that what these trade agreements really did was to criminalize corporate crime control. Okay, now maybe that's just sort of jargony language for a lot of people, but criminalizes attempts to control corporate harms and corporate misdeeds. So let's say the U.S. or Canada decides to pass some kind of legislation that makes it easier for Canadian companies to develop alternative renewable energy, and fossil fuel companies in the U.S. or elsewhere don't like this. They can go to the trade agreements, to the World Trade Organization, or to other secretive bodies and basically say that's a restraint on free trade. They can't do that. That's illegal.
Yeah.
It's illegal under trade law. And normally what happens is these secretive trade bodies then say, yeah, that's illegal. That's a restraint of free trade. You can't do that. So what they're doing again is making it illegal, or again criminalizing efforts to control corporate harms or to advance other kinds of interests. And these trade agreements already have very weak environmental and labor standards to begin with, but when countries do try to impose tougher environmental standards or try to do something about imposing labor standards, protecting workers' health in the workplace, for example, if some corporation feels that that's an infringement on their ability to engage in free trade, they can run to these trade bodies and get it overturned.
Well, you see that this week with the British courts holding Shell liable for all the environmental destruction that they've done in Nigeria.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they basically have ruined whole towns and whole villages and polluted and done it with impunity for years.
Yeah.
And didn't want to own up to it, and let alone not want to pay damages back to the people that lived there.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a good example.
And the more states buy into these free trade agreements, the less likely it is that their own domestic courts can intervene or their domestic legislatures can do something about that. Because again, in the broader picture of international free trade, it becomes a violation and restraint on that free trade. So hopefully the Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to get a lot more attention,
That's what I
and
hope.
there has to be a lot of very vigorous opposition on the part
Yes,
of labor
yes.
unions and would hope-
Environmentalists?
Yeah.
environmentalists, and would hope that the Democratic Party itself would
Stand up for
caution the
this.
president not to go this route, not to do this, not to harm the American people further with another one of these restrictive trade agreements.
Now, what's the status of that? That's coming up soon, or we don't know? They'd like to move on it now,
They
but it's
wanna-
all behind the scenes.
You know, so much of it has been secretive, so it is kind of hard to say where it's at, but I think very soon the Congress is going to be voting on whether to grant the fast-tracked authority to the
Boy.
president.
We got to be ready for that one.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, if their history is anything, if it's something that Obama is for, then maybe there'll be more people that'll come out against it. You know, just not to give him something for his legacy.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's
Yeah.
true.
So it'll be
Maybe we
interesting
have-
to see what the middle of the Republican Party does with this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's the only hope, Felix, is that there will be a substantial number of Republicans who will object to granting the president this authority, even though their own corporate backers might find
Oh,
it
yeah.
to be to
Yeah.
their advantage to do so.
They're going to be torn.
But again, with an eye towards 2016
Exactly.
too. So.
Always. Always.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
one of the things they're looking at for 2016 is funders. And if the funders are saying, hey, this is going to help us a lot, they'll probably go for it. Yeah.
And I think this moves us to the discussion of climate change. Certainly, this is, to me, this is the most important moral, social, and political issue of our time. And, you know, again, the trade agreements will hinder our ability to deal with climate change. Several things happened with regard to climate change in the previous year. First of all, several world bodies have just recently come out and documented that last year was the warmest year on
Yeah.
record. The warmest year on record was last year.
Wow.
And so since the pre-industrial age. So, and we certainly knew already that things were getting worse because the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN organization, all the major climate scientists in the world come
Yeah.
together in this body, continually monitoring all the research that's done and is published, and drawing conclusions. It had been a number of years, it had been 4 years since they had put out a new assessment report. So this is the 5th assessment report that they have generated in their time since 1992. And it was grim, very grim reading in terms of documenting all the problems that are already occurring due to the global warming. And we're only at about a 1% Celsius increase over the pre-industrial average, and it's easily projected that we're going to go to 2 and well above that if we don't keep many of the fossil fuels in the ground. So already at this level we are seeing problems, and we know it's only going to get worse as the temperatures continue to rise. And so the IPCC report, I think, should have been given even more publicity than it was, because it's the
Yeah.
starkest warning yet that we have from the scientists. These are the experts. These are the people who make their life studying the climate, and they're coming out with increasingly dire warnings about what we're doing.
And the science issue, which, you know, some people who are climate deniers, the science issue is settled.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an overwhelming majority, 98% of scientists who have studied this, who've said, yes, we have impacted the climate, not
Right.
only in this country, but in the world in general,
Yeah.
with what we've done as human beings in terms of
Yeah.
putting pollution in the air. That's settled. But the folks who are denying it, they're arguing against an overwhelming tide of science.
Right. And all they try to do is sow doubt.
Yeah.
Sow doubt. Now, I don't think people appreciate who's on the IPCC. I mean, it's like 115 scientists, isn't it?
Oh, I think it's even more than that.
More than that.
Yeah, yeah, hundreds of scientists
Hundreds
from around
of
the world.
scientists from all over the
All
world.
over the world, right.
Who have no stake in falsifying information. And like you say, this is their life, this is their work, this is their passion.
Right.
And I mean, it's authoritative what they're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, as Felix said, the scientific consensus is just overwhelming. And yet we still see the efforts to deny the science, to concoct weird conspiracy theories, or to pull out one particular finding and take it completely out of context and try to make that like to be the central issue. I
Yeah.
mean, there are all kinds of techniques that are used by the the climate deniers.
Well, there's a lot of corporate and dark money that's behind that too.
You bet.
There is.
You bet.
A lot of the corporate denialism comes from right-wing think tanks like the Heartland Institute, and they're funded by ExxonMobil, or at least they used to be. And the Koch brothers have channeled all kinds of dark money to these conservative think tanks, and they're funding a lot of the people who are deniers. They find somebody who has some scientific credentials, not in the realm of science, not in climate science, but in some other area, and they fund them generously, and then they come out and say, well, this scientist disputes what those other scientists say. But, well, these scientists study climate change, this scientist does not, and this scientist just took huge amounts of money from the fossil fuel industry.
Right.
So yeah, it's that remains an important issue. You know, the U.S. is far behind the rest of the world in accepting the scientific consensus, and of course, we have so many deniers in the Congress, and now, of course, they're in charge of the key committees that deal with science in the Senate and the House, and so it's pretty bleak right now. If we look to what might be happening in our own Congress with regard to this issue, not a lot's going to happen.
And this is an issue for us here in Kalamazoo because our congressman is on a very key committee which deals with all this.
Right,
and
Fred
he is a
Upton.
denier.
Yeah, he's a denier.
Fred Upton is the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is a key committee on dealing with environmental legislation. And Fred, of course, as we've said many times in this show, used to acknowledge that climate change was real and human caused. He had information up on his website about that, saying everything needed to be on the table, we needed to do everything we could. And then after he was challenged by the right in his primary and for the chair of this committee, he switched around, became a denier, threw in his lot with the Koch brothers and their Americans for Prosperity, and has tried to prevent the EPA from doing even minimal things to deal with climate change. So but that's the only hope right now. The Environmental Protection Agency in the Obama administration did push forward back in June some new regulations on coal-fired power plants. The Republicans are all up in arms about this, and they have at several other times tried to strip away from the EPA its ability to regulate greenhouse gases.
Right.
And the Supreme Court of the United States, even the more conservative Supreme Court, did say in Massachusetts versus EPA that, yes, the EPA does have the legal authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon emissions. So they have this authority. They haven't really used it yet. They're starting to move in that direction. Very, very slowly, I would say. I think they need to do more, but they're beginning to take some steps, and now with the current Congress, there'll be continued opposition to anything the EPA tries to do on this. A couple of other things with regard to the climate change issue. Last year, we saw back in September the largest march in history.
Right, you were there.
To deal with climate change, climate justice. I was there in New York City with 300,000 of my closest friends.
Wow.
And we marched through Midtown Manhattan, and the march itself was to coincide with a summit that was called at the UN. UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon had organized a summit bringing world leaders together in New York to talk about what's going to happen this coming December in Paris. There'll be another round of negotiations, what's called a conference of parties, that will take place in Paris in December. And everybody's sort of pointing to Paris this December as the key point at which we might try to get some kind of international agreement. And we have to have some kind of international agreement. It can't just be one country deciding they're going to try to reduce their emissions if we don't get everybody. And China's got to be involved. The European Union has to be involved. We need to get India involved. So there has to be some kind of international agreement. There has to be some recognition that the global north has a greater responsibility for the carbon that's already been emitted. So there has to be some aspect of justice in terms of how we deal with this. One hopeful sign is that China and the United States did come to some kind of an agreement back in the fall. And so that's a very important first step. But we need to move even beyond that. And so hopefully everything is geared toward coming up with an agreement in Paris in December of this year. And so that's why the climate march took place in New York City. And again, 300,000 people marching through Midtown Manhattan demanding that there be climate justice.
You'd love to be able to take all the deniers and have them spend a day in Shanghai or Beijing.
Oh my gosh.
And because I've had friends who have spent time in both those cities, and they will tell you that the amount of people who come out on their normal day wearing surgical masks because the air quality is just so bad. It's horrible.
Terrible.
And to think that's not having an impact on people's lives both in the short run and the long run, to me, it's just ludicrous.
Yeah, right.
Because it's there right for you to see.
Yeah, China is recognizing, because of that extreme level of pollution, that they've got to do something about their coal plants.
Right.
And so I think that they have done a lot in terms of renewables, more than we have done. And they want to continue to go in that direction, but they wanted to get an agreement with the U.S. that's going to make both of the two major economies in the world working together to advance reducing carbon emissions and to promote renewable energy. And that's the direction that we have to go. And there's no reason why we can't. Stanford University researchers have documented in the last couple of years that we could go completely 100% renewable in a very short period of time, actually, if we invested the proper resources in developing those technologies.
But here's the interesting piece there that sort of pushes Americans back from making those types of decisions is what's happened to the price of oil in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
See, when fossil fuel prices are extremely low like they are now, people are not likely to think about other alternatives.
That's right.
Whether it makes sense for it to that happen or not, they just don't. Because I'm only paying $2 a gallon for gas now. When it was $4 a gallon, people think about those things because it affects them in their everyday lives.
It's very short-term thinking, isn't it? If I'm getting this, I can get away with this. This is not bad. And that's the hardest thing about climate change. We're talking, obviously some terrible things are happening now, but ordinary people aren't feeling it. It's a longer run struggle that's got it. But I was in New York for a conference, and I heard a guy speak who was a researcher, just came back from about 6 years in China. And one of the things that's happening with them is food poisoning now, because the pollution is getting into the rice fields, and people are eating contaminated food. And that's really trying to change things around a lot, because they don't want that to happen. It is happening. They got to stop it.
One of the other significant things with regard to climate change was the publication of Naomi Klein's new book, which is titled "This Changes Everything." And anyone who's familiar with Naomi Klein, she's an outstanding journalist, Canadian journalist. Her previous books, No Logo and Shock Doctrine, were amazingly well-researched and well-written books. And she's devoted 5 years to producing this particular book, which is really a very critical, intensive analysis of the climate change issue. There's just tons of stuff packed into that book, and what I'm hoping is that we will get a chance to devote a program to discussing this book, maybe invite our friend Denise Keel to come back. She's just recently read the book also. And by the way, we're going to have a community discussion of the book coming up in April 9th at the Kalamazoo Public Library. So hopefully people can get that on their calendar right away. It'll take place that evening of April 9th at the Public Library, and members of the WMU Climate Change Working Group will be there to help facilitate some of the discussion to take place that night. But I really would like to encourage people to read this book, and in fact, through the program that we're going to offer, free copies of the book can be made available. So people can request and get free copies of the book. We'll have information about that coming out pretty soon. So this book's an amazing book, and it's also, to some extent, a very hopeful book. She feels that there's still time for us to do things, but obviously we have to have a mass movement, a transcendent social movement that's going to come together to really help make sure that we reduce those emissions, develop the alternative sources, and develop the kind of localized economies that we'll need to have to survive in the future. So I encourage everybody to read Klein's book, and again, we're going to have the community discussion of the book coming up in April. And we have another person that's coming out to ring in on the issue of climate change.
The Pope.
The Pope.
The Pope he's apparently writing an encyclical, which is a letter to the whole church, authoritative letter to the whole church coming out from the Pope. And I get the impression, it's definitely going to come out this year, but in the remarks that he's made, he's been very strong about the critical nature of this. In fact, right now he's visiting the Philippines, who have just undergone tremendous damage from hurricanes and terrible storms. And he connects that to the whole climate change things and saying these people are the victims and that we are just misusing God's gift to us in this earth and for selfish reasons, and it's got to change. So I think that will throw a spotlight on this issue in a way that few other things could. He just yesterday, he came out with some very strong statements about the misuse of the earth and how we have to change and be better stewards of this whole thing, or catastrophe awaits us.
Yeah.
So that's very good that he's doing that. I'm
Yeah,
very pleased
yeah.
that he's doing that.
No, that's really, any kind of moral voice that can be brought to bear on this problem, I think, is necessary. I just want to pick up one other issue from the book, Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. She's got a chapter on something that she calls extractivism as a kind of broad industrial policy. And of course, much of the book focuses on capitalism as an economic system and the way it fosters extractivism and fosters environmental destruction. But it goes beyond capitalism as well. Extractivism is more of a mindset that the earth is here, we can exploit the earth and damage the earth and advance human issues without any regard to the damage that we're doing. And that's a perspective that runs so counter to many native cultures. If you really look at the indigenous cultures, their attitude toward the earth is 100% different than that. And in fact, Naomi Klein spends a lot of time in the book talking about indigenous cultures and their resistance to extractivism. And what's happened with the oil companies is, and the fossil fuel industry in general, is that most of the easy access to fossil fuels are gone. The only thing left now are the more extreme forms. So deep water drilling that brought us the Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, the fracking issue, the extraction of the tar sands up in Canada, which leads to the Keystone XL pipeline issue. And so these more extreme forms, which do even more damage to the environment, to the local environments, and yet also are giving us even dirtier fossil fuels that then only increase the amount of carbon that's being spewed into the atmosphere. So this mindset of extractivism and this effort to go after extreme dirty energy is a big part of the problem that we're facing right now.
And there was another dimension to this, is what this is doing to different species. There's a book that came out this year called The Sixth Extinction.
Elizabeth Colbert.
And she talks about how we are destroying so many different species, and it doesn't matter. It's okay. Whatever's going to make us money, that's all that counts. And that's such a narrow point of view.
Short-term way of looking at the world.
Short-term way of looking at it. Yeah, I'm anxious I haven't read that.
That's a great book too. Yes, it's a great book, The Sixth Great Extinction in Human History, or the history of the Earth rather. And she's also a journalist who does amazingly good work, research and well-written work. So that's another one I would highly recommend to people. All right, what other issues, Felix, that you wanted to get in?
I think Don and I were talking about this before, the whole issue of policing.
Yes.
And justice and issues of inequality. Those are big issues that came to the fore this year with the events in Ferguson and in New York City, in Cleveland, and in Milwaukee.
Absolutely. Huge issues. And we're going to have a series, you both know this, through the Lewis Walker Institute. We're going to have a series about minorities in the criminal justice system and all the dimensions of that. The police-community relations is one thing, and the number. I just read an article by Isabel Wilkinson in The Guardian the other day. She was talking about lynchings at the time.
Yeah, I read that,
Yeah, that there was an average of a lynching every 4 days. Now, there's an average of a policeman killing a minority person every 4 days. The same as was happening with the lynching. So we're back to this craziness now. We're back to militarization on the streets of the cities. We have to rethink the whole way that we look at how we do policing.
And
in
the
this
thing
country.
about it is, and Ron knows this as well, crime is down in this country.
Exactly,
So
dramatically.
the whole excessive use of force has followed a completely different path,
Yeah.
given what the statistics are telling us about criminal behavior.
That's right.
You know.
That's right. And I try to make a distinction between what's happening nationally and what's happening in the city. We're not perfect in the city.
No.
We're far from it. We know that. But our chief has made enormous efforts to try to move forward on this whole issue. And I think he's done some very great things. But there's more to it. How come we have so many people of color in the criminal justice incarcerated? I mean, it's terribly out of proportion. And what does that do to them for the rest of their lives? You've worked on this all your life.
In terms of the ability to vote, in terms of the ability to be able to hold down a job,
Yeah.
to borrow money, to buy a house, to borrow a car, it limits you in all those areas.
Exactly, exactly. And so much of this is connected to poverty. And, you know, it's just a reflection of if we don't put the supports, you always talk about this, Ron, social supports reduce crime, lack of social supports increase crime. And we know, I mean, they can go into a third grade and tell how many prison cells they have to have in 10 years because of the zip code of where that kid lives. That's all part of the picture.
It's a
And then
huge difference.
the other part of the picture is what happens when people get out? What do we do about that? And you've been working on that.
Do we help them out? Do we have an infrastructure? Are we only interested in locking people up and not helping them once they get out? Because we put all these barriers in the way of people trying to succeed, and what they then do is they regress back to the mean, which is what they know.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
If I can't vote, if I can't hold down a job, I can't participate in normal civic society, I'm going to go back to doing what I normally did so I can get by.
I have to survive.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So this is something we're going to be looking at. Lewis Walker's, we're going to have a series of discussions on this, and we're going to do them around the city. We're going to do some on campus, but we're also going to do some in the community. We hope to do one on juvenile justice at the juvenile home, and do one hopefully on one of the churches on the north side, one of the downtown churches, to try to really get the community involved in this whole issue. It's enormous. But there's an encouraging piece to this for me, and that is the number of young people that have been involved in this movement. I mean, so many times in the social movements that we see today, it's older
older
folks,
demographic,
like you guys.
Yeah.
But now it's young people that are out there really beating the bushes and getting into this thing.
And we
So
haven't seen the likes of that since the 60s.
That's right.
In terms of young people being involved.
Exactly, exactly. So that's very encouraging.
And they've been able to sustain it too.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
And Dan, I wanted to also mention that the Lewis Walker Institute, in addition to the series on mass incarceration that you're developing, in addition to that, the Walker Institute is helping to put together a teach-in which will be on police violence, racism, and social justice. And that will take place on Thursday, the 22nd of January. That's coming up.
Got it on my calendar,
It'll
Good.
start at 5:30.
Right.
There will be a light meal offered at 5:30, and then the plenary session that starts at 6 o'clock. Dr. Walker himself, Lou Walker, and Doug Davidson, and the director
Reddy.
of
Tim
the
Reddy,
Walker
yeah.
Institute, Tim
I met
Reddy,
Tim earlier this week, so.
are going to present a broad overview of the issues, and then there will be breakout sessions facilitated by faculty and students at Western. So we really want to encourage people to come out to the
Absolutely.
teach-in at the Lewis Walker Institute, which is located in Wellborn Hall on the university campus. If anybody knows where the roundabout, the traffic circle
Yeah.
is on campus, just go around the traffic circle, head back out toward Howard Street, and Wellborn Hall is on the right-hand side.
It's not terribly complicated.
It's not hard to get
The
to.
way they usually remember it is it's across the street from where you pay your parking tickets. That's how they usually, oh, okay, I
That's how
got it.
students will
right
remember it
there.
for sure.
That's
so.
how students remember it.
And I talked today to Don Webster from our public services department, you know, our police department, and he's going to be there, and one of the captains is going to be there, because we wanted a police presence there to be, because what we want to say is, how can we work together to improve this whole situation? So this Thursday, it's going to be big.
Yeah, Thursday the 22nd. Also, we did a show, a critical issue show, a while back on this very topic. So remember, you can always check out our shows, folks, on YouTube. Just type in critical issues, alternative views on YouTube. All of our past programs come up, and we did do one. Felix was here as a guest that time, and we did do a show devoted to this issue. So we have looked at it in a bit more depth. Let's move on. I wanted to make sure we get into the issue of nuclear weapons, one of my
Yeah, go
favorite
ahead.
issues to look at over time. And just a couple of things are going on here that I think people ought to know about. And one, again, is where I have to be very critical of the Obama administration, because they are undertaking a program of, quote, modernization
Jeez.
of our nuclear forces. And they're preparing to spend $1 trillion, let me say that again, $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, to modernize our nuclear weapons facilities. Now, it's true that there's some deterioration of these facilities and some problems and dangers there, but the thing is that we're legally obligated to move toward disarmament.
Yeah.
There is something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in 1968, and it legally obligates the United States and any other country that holds nuclear weapons to begin to enter into negotiations to end up with complete disarmament. And we have not done that. We have not held up our end of the bargain on that treaty, because the rest of the world agreed not to seek nuclear weapons if the nuclear powers would agree to move forward with disarmament. And so we are in complete and utter violation of this international law. By the way, this May of 2015, there will be a new review session at the United Nations on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so I hope, again, this review takes place every 5 years, and unfortunately, the same issues keep coming up, but nothing ever gets resolved. But I'm hoping that world pressure will continue to build on the nuclear powers to really uphold their end of the bargain, and that is to seek through disarmament to eliminate nuclear weapons, which President Obama himself pledged to do when he first took office. And one of the reasons that he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe. Now, there's one other development here that is important, and that is that the Marshall Islands, a small little Pacific island, a group of islands, has filed an important lawsuit against the 9 nuclear weapon states. It's called the Nuclear Zero Lawsuits, and it basically says, look, you guys all agreed in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that you would seek disarmament, and you're not doing it, so we're suing you to make you to do it. And so this is a lawsuit that's advancing, and so again, something people can look forward to, the Marshall Islands Nuclear Zero Lawsuits that are advancing against the 9 nuclear weapons powers.
Is that at the World Court?
It'll go to the World Court. Yeah. So that's proceeding apace right now, so that's something to look forward to. And one other thing, this year, 2015, is going to be the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombings. So this coming August, the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we can expect, again, I think, some rather large commemorative events to go around in a significant anniversary like that. 70 years into the nuclear age, and we're still wrestling with this problem, this existential crisis of possessing weapons that have the capability of destroying the Earth. We're destroying the Earth through climate change, but we could also destroy the Earth much more quickly and easier through nuclear weapons. So both of these are twin problems that have to be addressed. And again, maybe on the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombings, forced by the Marshall Islands lawsuit and the review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, maybe we can begin to move ahead on this particular issue. What else do we have?
Really, really important.
Lots of stuff going on this past year and heading into this year.
Gay marriage is a big issue, not only in Michigan, but across the country. And I know that the appeals court yesterday ruled in favor of the Michigan couples that got married on that single day where it was legal.
Good.
And I know that the Supreme Court, at least today, is supposed to weigh in as to whether or not they're going to hear a cluster of states' cases in their next session, in which they may rule on the whole issue for the whole country. So it's going to be critical.
Right. The whole tide is running in the direction of recognizing the rights of gay and lesbian, transgender people.
Because I believe there are 37 states now.
Yes.
Where it's legal.
37.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think the court almost has to take this case on, because the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals down in Cincinnati, ruling on the Michigan law, and some others from this particular circuit ruled differently than all the other circuit courts have been ruling. So we have different opinions from different circuit courts, at least one lone dissenter. So I think the Supreme Court is going to have to take this case on and step in. I'm confident that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of same-sex marriage.
I mean, the Constitution, if we look at the 13th and 14th Amendment, basically is crystal clear on equal protection of the laws. and that's the way it should be.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And just on a more pragmatic note, I think the key vote, as usual, is going to be Justice Kennedy. It almost always comes down with the current court, the 4 conservatives, the 4 liberal members, and then Kennedy is usually the swing vote. I think Justice Kennedy has already given some indications that he would vote with the liberal branch of the court on this particular issue. So I think the court should accept it, and I think it would be a victory for the LGBT community and for all of us if same-sex marriage were to become legalized all across the country.
Because in the body of work that I'm doing, diversity and inclusion, to me, it's one of the critical issues.
Absolutely.
If we're going to create an environment where all people are welcome, we can't have these archaic laws that say, well, it's illegal,
Yes.
for you to be here, or I don't have to serve you because it offends me. I said, those things they're archaic, they make no sense at all, and they don't create a welcoming environment whatsoever.
None at all. And in the state, we were giving health care to domestic partners, but the state told us we couldn't do that. So what we did in the city was we said, okay, we won't just give them to gay and lesbian, anybody who's a domestic partner, we'll give them the health care, and that's how we got around it. But we have to dance around these restrictive, discriminatory laws. I have been tremendously impressed by how well organized this movement is and how effective they have been in getting their issues on the table and winning on their issues. That's a real model that we got to look at for the rest of the issues that we're talking about.
And a really good piece that Frank Bruni wrote in the New York Times this week that I would recommend people read is called Your God and My Dignity. It's about religious liberty, bigotry, and gays. It's a really, well thought out piece
a look at it.
that I posted on my Facebook page, but I think, it's definitely salient to the issues that we're dealing with here in Michigan and other places around the country.
Good. Bruni writes well. I like
He's a good writer.
Yeah.
I think you can see the impact of this, and it's a very broad-based social movement. It's well supported by young people, overwhelmingly young people.
Yeah.
This is not even an issue. They're puzzled why this is even an issue. And so overwhelmingly the tide is moving in this direction. And I think you can see it. Jeb Bush, who wants to get in the presidential race, had to come out this week and moderate what he had said previously about this issue. Now, he didn't say anything. It made no sense. It was a ridiculous statement. But at least he had to backtrack and modify and obfuscate the issue a little bit because
he felt the pressure.
He felt
with
the
an eye
pressure.
towards 2016 too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
only reason. Yeah. Well, the other issue that I think continues is the whole inequality issue. The economy's getting better, but middle-class lives aren't getting better, and people at the bottom are still having very little chance of moving up into another status. And we're not addressing that as a nation. The reality is that we have a worse poverty rate than we did in 1972, 73. And people's wages have not gone up in 30 years, little bit over the last 6 months.
And the disparity between people at the very top and people at the bottom has increased,
double.
So many times. So
Gross national product has doubled, but people's salaries have remained the same. So all that money goes into people's pocket at the top. And I think this is an international issue. When I look at what happened in Paris, and there was an article in the Times today I was looking at where it was talking about how in the urban areas where so many Islamic people live in terrible poverty, they didn't take the solidarity with the other people in this whole thing because they're living in such misery and they don't feel like they're a real part of what's going on there. And I think the same thing is happening in this country. And I think it's the same thing that the answer to every problem is militarism. It's not going to be militarism. It's going to be looking at inequality. And if we don't look at inequality, I think we're going to have Ferguson's a good example of that. Ferguson is not just about police-community relation. It's about all the underlying things, the injustice, the inequality that goes on in that area. And that's going to happen in a lot of places here if we don't look at this whole question of inequality.
If you don't address the underlying structural conditions that give rise to inequality, then inevitably you have to use police force and militarization to tramp down the opposition that's going to inevitably grow out of that structural inequality.
And we
So-
saw that happen all throughout the 60s.
Exactly,
In the United
exactly.
States, you know. I don't find that to be a coincidence at all. They were dealing with some of the same issues that Dr. King was working and fighting for in the 60s today.
Exactly. And I showed in my class yesterday on Martin Luther King's birthday at the River I Stand, which is about Memphis. And how in Memphis, what did they do? They sent police out, they sent military out on the streets. And the militarization of our police forces today, with bringing tanks and everything onto the street, we're back to the same place we were in the 60s. We have to get beyond that. We have to get to a position where we treat people. Dr. King talked about the three great evils of militarism, racism, and economic exploitation. That's exactly what we're facing today, and these are the core issues we got to address.
And Dr. King said that he could never again speak to the violence that was taking place in the ghettos without first addressing the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, which is my own government.
Exactly.
And he was talking, of course, about Vietnam, but since that time, of course, the U.S. military has continued to grow. The primary solution that the United States seems to have to any foreign policy problem is more violence,
Yeah.
more military efforts, and of course the Pentagon budget has grown to be such a gargantuan element of our budget. We're talking well over $1 trillion every year of our money goes into the military. That's not just the Pentagon.
Seven times as much as our nearest competitor in the world.
Oh yeah, way above that. And then again, it's not just the Pentagon budget itself, but it's all the other spending on nuclear weapons and Veterans Affairs and such related to military spending. So when you add all that together, it's $1 trillion. And as you say, Felix, so much more than any other nation in the world feels like it has to spend. If we had more time, we could come back and talk about what's happening. The third phase of the Iraq War, I guess, is undergoing. The invasion of Iraq created the conditions for an Islamic militant group to form, the Islamic State, ISIL, or whatever you want to call it. They go by so many different names. But the rise of that militant group is a direct result of the invasion and occupation of Iraq and the destruction of that country. And so now we find ourselves bombing once again, sending troops back into Iraq. And so again, the Iraq War has simply morphed into another phase. And of course, the continuation of the drone warfare in Afghanistan and the border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen. And we have some local groups that are organizing to protest the use of drones because they end up always killing innocent civilians. The Air Force, the National Guard base over in Battle Creek is now going to be an operations center for drone warfare. And so we have a group of local citizens in Battle Creek and Kalamazoo that are coming together. They're having a monthly presence at the base to protest the fact that this now will be an operations center, to protest drone warfare. And again, and we've talked about this many times on the program, is that the military violence, the use of drones to try to, quote, fight a war on terrorism only results in more terrorism. It only creates, because we are invading other people's countries, because we are killing innocent civilians, we are creating more and more anger, and that leads to even more terrorism taking place. And so it's an endless cycle of violence that we find ourselves in. So if we had more time, we could get into that whole issue.
There's a reason that, before we went into Afghanistan, that one of the commentators said that, historically speaking, this has been the graveyard of empires.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we're finding out. The Russians spent 20 years there, and they found that out, and we're going through the same exercise and finding out the same thing, that we haven't really solved anything.
And the British before them.
War is not the answer.
So we have about 4 minutes left. We're really down to, I'll throw out one other thing that happened this past year that I think is significant, that I think we can devote a program to later, and that is the Senate Intelligence Committee came out with its torture report. Now, we've known for a long time that the U.S. engaged in torture after 9/11.
Those were enhanced interrogation techniques, not torture.
Yeah, right. But now the Senate Intelligence, and this isn't even the full report, this is just the executive summary, heavily redacted, but it verifies much of what we already knew, and has, again, raised this issue of why the United States engaged in torture, and will there be any accountability for that. And I hope we can devote a program to that later on. So we got 3 minutes left. Any other final issues?
I just want to say on that, that is clearly a recruiting tool for terrorists. It really is. And so many of them have said, when I saw the torture that was going on, and you can see how they would react to that, for sure. Yeah.
That in Abu Ghraib, yeah.
Yeah, right. Abu Ghraib.
Because
yeah.
it goes against everything that we Americans have always said that we stood for,
Right, right.
that set us apart, that made us, quote, exceptional.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
So one more issue that you think is going to be a big issue in 2015 with 2 minutes to go.
Living wages.
Living wages?
I think it was really important that the fast food workers risk their jobs to go out and demand $15 an hour. And I think that they are the symbols of this whole struggle for living wages in the country.
and I think the continued evolution of marriage equality is going to be a
Yes.
big issue this year.
Absolutely.
I think the Supreme Court will finally weigh in and make a decision that will codify into law what it's going to be for all 50 states here.
And I think another issue that we didn't get a chance to talk about today that I think is going to play a role in the coming year is the crisis in the Ukraine and in a sense, the development of a new Cold War. That plays into so many of the issues that we've already talked about, whether it's the nuclear weapons issue or whether it's foreign policy in the Middle East. Again, I think this is really an important issue for us to focus on. And I think the West has badly handled the situation in the Ukraine and have needlessly aggravated the situation there. And that doesn't do anybody any good, and it hinders our ability. If we're going to produce solutions, we're going to have international agreements. And the Russians are going to have to be a part of that.
Absolutely.
Just as the Chinese are going to have to be a big part of dealing with climate change or any other important issue. We've got to get to the point where we are finding ways to cooperate with other countries and
Instead of
solving
trying to impose our will.
Yes.
especially
yes.
trying to impose our will through forms of violence. And as we find out that generally tends to backfire. Anytime we tend to use military force in recent years, we see that the results are never what we intend and never what we predict.
It's more costly, we stay there longer, we lose more lives, and we don't end up changing anybody's hearts and minds.
And we generate even more anger and resentment at the United States. So, well, no shortage of issues to look back on or to look forward to in the coming year. And hopefully we will be able to come back and address a number of these issues more in depth than some of our other programs. One of the nice things about doing a program that goes for a full hour, you can do a little bit of in-depth analysis rather than the 20-second soundbite on CBS National News. So I invite you to come back and join us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. Check us out on YouTube. And we hope to see you here next time on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. Thanks for being with us.